He had everything: money, influence, a stadium full of people who hung on the cadence of his sentences. The rain came down hard that Sunday night, tapping against the SUV's armored glass like 1,000 quiet questions. Inside, Pastor Samuel Williams stared at his reflection in the rear view as the wipers swept the world clean for a moment and then left it wet and blurred again. The city lights smeared through water. The stadium's glow was a pale halo in the distance. On the radio, an assistant's voice gave last-minute instructions. On his lap lay a stack of prepared notes, carefully circled lines he had rehearsed. He was a man accustomed to shaping truth into applause. And then he saw the boy. Under the highway bridge, in the shallow glow of a flickering street lamp, a small figure sat on a plastic crate. The boy's hair was plastered to his forehead. He had a broken umbrella propped uselessly beside him. In his lap, the pages of a Bible were wet and curling. He read aloud in the steady small voice of someone who had chosen the world of story over the world of noise. Samuel blinked, turned the wheel, and pulled the SUV off the road as if the sight had the authority to stop engines. The city's roar dimmed beneath the rain. For a moment there was only the boy and the Bible and the rain and the sudden, impossible sense that the man who had built an empire of words was the one being taught. If this scene resonates with you, pause and subscribe. Join a community that chooses compassion over convenience. Stay with this until the end. The asking is honest, and the answer is costly. Inside the mansion, a different kind of rain had long been falling: cold silences, clinking forks, and carefully measured conversations. Grace moved through rooms with a polite tiredness, smoothing throws, turning down lights, tending the home like a sanctuary set aside for image as much as for family. Chris sat at the bar with a drink he did not need. Laughter loud where softness might have been. Nicole retreated to the bedroom where pills and playlists blurred the edges of her days. Samuel's sermons filled auditoriums. His children filled gaps with habits instead of with hearts. He was well known enough that people fashioned headlines from his pauses. He was wealthy enough that those pauses were forgiven. He was influential enough that men in suits counted his endorsements as currency. But those things, stadiums, endorsements, a name printed in gold letters, did not fill a vacancy he had learned to keep private. He wondered about legacy. He wondered what would remain of him if everything named Samuel Williams were removed. The chairs, the portraits, the plaques, the bank figures. He did not know his own poverty until a boy in the rain let him see it. Samuel pulled up under the bridge and shut off the engine. For a moment he sat, feeling the rain through the metal, feeling the ridiculousness of his expensive trousers and designer shoes. The boy looked up as the door opened. The air between them was a thin thread of cold and curiosity. "Hi!" the boy said, his voice not small because he was shy, but because he had been conserving it. "My name is Kevin." Samuel stepped out and the rain hit his head, cold and relentless. He closed the distance, slowed his breathing. He had always known how to speak to crowds. Speaking to a child in the rain required something else: humility. "Why are you out here?" he asked. Kevin held his Bible closer, like a map. "The rain reminds me God is washing the earth," he said simply. "The Bible keeps me warm. I like to read so I know where to go." There was a layer of childlike logic there that made Samuel's chest unclench in a way no accolade ever had. Other pastors had used that line, "The world is washed clean," in baptismal language, but here it landed as a conviction, not a sermon. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Samuel asked, and before the rehearsed questions could line up, he found himself asking softer things. Kevin shrugged the way a child shrugs a heavy coat. "I stay by the bridge," he said. "This is where my people are. I feed them when I can. I read to them. They like when I read about the big people in the stories. They say I make the night easier." Samuel listened. The bridge smelled like wet tar and the stubborn, oily perfume of the city. A woman in the distance lifted a plastic cup and waved. A man with a scar on his cheek, Moses, rose and approached with the slow dignity of someone who had been appointed an unofficial guardian of the night. When Moses reached the SUV, he tipped an invisible hat toward Samuel with a face worn by long kindness. Moses was the kind of person Samuel's security officers would have catalogued as non-essential, and yet as the two men looked at one another, there was an exchange between them that no advisor could have anticipated. Moses had watched years of ministers and money, of promises and plate offerings. He had also watched the small acts of mercy that did not make it into the evening news. "He's got more books than all the children in the shelter," Moses said softly, nodding at Kevin. "He don't keep 'em. He gives 'em away." Samuel knelt without thinking about it. He did not know how to explain the automaticness of the gesture. It felt right to put his hands in the mud and wet his knees where the boy's feet had been. He did it with the awkwardness of a man who had only ever knelt in rooms with cameras arranged to capture his humility from the right angle. This time, the cameras were rain and scaffolding and a tarpaulin of a sky. He felt the mud creep into the expensive fabric of his trousers, and for the first time the expense seemed meaningless. Why would a pastor kneel before a child? A reporter might later ask. The answer was not simple. Kevin didn't flinch. He slid a page in the Bible over to Samuel with the easy expectation of sharing. "You like to read?" Samuel asked, and Kevin nodded. "I like where they say the Lord is near to the broken-hearted," Kevin replied, voice even. "It helps me when it is dark." Samuel read the line aloud with a voice so practiced it might have been mistaken for a sermon. Only here the throat caught. He had the words memorized in a way every minister does. The difference was that a 5-year-old had lived them more than he had. Humility arrived in a sentence, and Samuel felt something inside him soften. They sat on the crate for a while, listening to rain, listening to the city. Samuel offered his coat. Kevin accepted, folding it as if it were another story he might one day return to tell. At the edge of the conversation, Samuel suggested, "Come to my house for a warm meal. For a night, Kevin. We can keep you safe." Kevin hesitated. "They'll miss me," he said. "I take them bread, and I read. I promised I'd be here." The exchange that followed was not about shelter and security alone. It was a lesson in loyalty. Kevin's people needed him. He had obligations that were not sentimental but real. Someone to pass around a biscuit. Someone to read the stories that kept cold men and women awake with dignity. Samuel realized Easter morning platitudes could not substitute for that kind of steady, day-in day-out presence. When he lifted Kevin into the SUV, it felt like boarding a small boat between worlds. The leather seats smelled of tobacco and expensive polish. Kevin's small hands left salt prints. The rain blurred the city into strokes of watercolor. Samuel had driven into the night like a man on a tight schedule. He came back with his timetable overturned. Inside the mansion, people paused mid-step and glanced at the mud on his trousers. Grace met Kevin with a smile that was more maternal than managerial. "You must be freezing," she told him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders the way someone learned to wrap emotional warmth around a husband who returned home with strange storms. Chris and Nicole watched from a doorway, smirks already forming like defense mechanisms. Chris made a show of clinking his glass on ironic bell while Nicole rolled her eyes without hiding it. The children of wealthy houses often have practiced ways of dismissing things that might require moral labor. They had been taught to appraise appearances. The right coat, the right name, the right circulation of status. A boy with a wet Bible disrupted the calculation. "Is this some kind of photo op?" Chris asked before Samuel could explain. The question landed like a thrown glove. Samuel's answers came slowly now. As a man who had been trained to deliver sound bites found himself dealing with complexity. "He was sitting in the rain," he said. "He reads the Bible. He cares for people under the bridge. It's symbolic." "We get it," Chris said. "We do. Charity, this is just theater," the household murmured. The staff whispered about the optics. Grace put a hand on Samuel's arm, the touch more steady than words. "Don't let the noise of the crowd make you forget why you went," she said. He nodded. She had the kind of faith that did not require spectacle for conviction. She had been beside him when the applause felt like it might be the highest form of worship. She had also seen him wrestle with nights when notes lined his desk and heart did not. Days that followed blurred into a kind of domestic experiment. Kevin ate with the family, sat at the foot of Samuel's study while books lay open like patience, and learned to navigate rooms that smelled of polish and expectation. he did not put on airs. He read to the gardener's kids on the weekend and taught a trembling one at the shelter to find his place in a psalm. He kept returning to the bridge at night, carrying sandwiches in a paper bag, reading aloud until his voice dissolved into the dark. He named the people, their Mrs. Aisha, who had been a seamstress; Samir, who kept an old wallet like a relic; Parker, who had lost a son to the city and read the evening news like a prayer. Samuel found himself taken into small circuits of service that money did not automatically fix. Giving a check was a goodness of the ledger. Staying to listen was something else. He began to drop by the bridge without making a speech. He sat and listened. He learned the names of the people he had once only noticed when they lined up politely at a food bank. He began to see the ways his sermons had sometimes been speeches in gold frames that failed to touch the ragged edges of life. One Sunday, one of those carefully staged Sundays when the stadium lights cut through fog and every camera angle favored an eloquent pause, Samuel did something his speechwriters had not planned. He brought Kevin onto the stage. The crowd had come for his sermon about stewardship. The band had finished the opening hymn and the cameras were poised. Samuel took the microphone and looked at Kevin, small against the LED backdrop that displayed looping images of outreaches and smiling donors. "This is Kevin," Samuel said. He was reading a Bible in the rain. "He taught me one of the first and truest lessons I have ever learned. He taught me that those we intend to serve are not trophies. They are people." The audience inhaled. For some, the image of a billionaire pastor making a child the centerpiece of a sermon was moving. For others, it was a stunt and optics play. The internet did what the internet does. Snippets of the moment looped overnight, captions telescoped into caricature, pundits debated motive. Some said the man had found his humanity. Some said he'd found his PR team. Some said both. At home, Chris felt humiliated. His father's imperfection shone like an exposed seam. Nicole felt whatever flicker of attention she could get had been diverted. "You just made a spectacle of us," Chris said that night, ears hot. "You made a charity case out of our living room." "I didn't come to make you feel small," Samuel responded, voice raw with a kind of honesty he rarely allowed himself in public. "I came because I thought I was the teacher. It turns out I needed to learn." The family argument that followed was not framed in charismatic cliches. It was a slow excavation of old wounds. Chris accused his father of being impulsive and Nicole accused him of abandoning them emotionally while maintaining a public saintliness. Grace tried to thread compassion between them. "We can't live only by our reputations," she said. "Something in him is changing. We either go with it, or we stay where we are." Samuel kept thinking of Kevin on that plastic crate, the way the boy had read about broken people and looked like someone who had given himself to a story. He thought about the millions he oversaw, endowments, buildings, investments that supported the work they did. He had been a steward in public language. The more he looked, the more he felt stewards are supposed to ask, not "What can my wealth build for my name?" but "What can my wealth build for the names that have been forgotten?" One afternoon he followed Kevin back to the bridge. He watched from a distance as Kevin walked barefoot over slick concrete, carrying sandwiches wrapped in paper. A pair of teenagers eyed him. They were desperate, the kind of hunger that read as abrasive rawness. The teens pushed toward Kevin and the sandwiches. Kevin stood his ground. "You can't take our food," he told them. "This is for the people I feed." The boy's assertion enraged one teen who lunged for the bag. The scene escalated threats, pushed shoulders, a sudden flurry of fear. Samuel intervened. Not like someone making a Bayesian calculation about risk, but simply placing himself between a kid with a torn sleeve and a larger boy with nails in his voice. He felt the mud climb his shoes. He felt the pull of his suit wet to the knees. "Back away," Samuel said. His voice did not carry a pulpit's rhetorical grace. It held the gruff insistence of someone defending human dignity. The teens backed off. Moses stepped forward and put a hand on Samuel's shoulder, eyes reading like a report of the soul. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know,"
Samuel said.
"But I will." That scene, an ordinary, small, and dangerous moment, did something to Samuel that months of reflection had not. He realized his presence mattered less because of the checkbook and more because of the willingness to be in the mess. Conversations with elders and advisors began to take a new shape. Samuel spoke about stewardship differently now. He began to say words that made some uncomfortable. I am not the owner of what I have been given. I am a steward. There are purposes beyond our family name and our security. He proposed reorienting resources toward programs that privilege dignity over dependence, apprenticeship programs, medical clinics, housing partnerships managed by people from the communities served. He wanted to structure funds so that those closest to need would have decision-making power. He wanted to take the money and craft it into something that distributed agency, not just aid. The practicalities were messy and not suddenly beautiful. Discussions with legal counsel, elders, and trustees were careful and deliberate. They spoke of risk, of optics, of spiritual leadership, and biblical responsibility. Samuel did not pretend his choice was purely theological. He knew it would hurt. He knew his children would feel displaced. But faith without cost, he had come to believe, was faith that retained the shape of comfort more than grace. The decision that would shock the world was not a singular flick of an impulsive hand. It was a series of long, sleepless nights. Samuel called his children into his study. The room smelled of old leather and coffee. Photographs lined the bookshelf, smiles frozen in lacquered frames. He locked eyes with Chris, then with Nicole. I want you to know something, Samuel said. I plan to redistribute how our resources are stewarded. I want our wealth to serve those who cannot serve themselves. That will mean changes to how my estate is directed. I also want to name Kevin as a steward for community-led initiatives, someone who has the heart for the people we want to serve. The words hit like a small tremor and then an aftershock. Chris's face hardened. You're disinheriting us, he said. The accusation was sharp and immediate. I'm not trying to take away what you have earned, Samuel replied, but I cannot leave our resources to be used only to maintain a name. I believe that the way we live as a family should reflect the faith we preach. That requires recalibration. Nicole laughed. A brittle sound. So, you're giving a child everything and telling us to go find meaningful work? It means I want you to find identity in service rather than in entitlement, Samuel said. And I will help you through that. But I will not keep our money in a way that prevents repentance and work. I will not leave this as an inheritance of leisure. The conversation that followed was long and messy. It is worth saying plainly. Samuel did not spring this on the world as a telegenic stunt. He prepared. He spoke with elders. He engaged legal counsel to understand implications without detailing them in sermons. He thought about the ethics of stewardship, about what it means to have resources and not make them instruments of power. He made sacrifices of his public image because he believed the public image was not the thing he was meant to leave behind. News of the decision leaked. Headlines turned the family into a morality place. Some papers called him generous. Others accused him of petulant theatrics. Late-night pundits tore at motives. The church office received calls from donors who failed to understand why a man would withdraw from conventional preservation. The elders met and debated and prayed. Samuel stood in the center of the swirl like a man whose convictions had a cost. The costs arrived in small particulars. There were strained holiday dinners. There were practical changes in household staff. Chris, stripped of some comforts he had taken for granted, found himself in unfamiliar workplace's first menial, then honest. He carried boxers, learned to square a lumber schedule, felt fatigue in a new way that taught humility rather than entitlement. It did not happen overnight. He failed at jobs, lied to friends about his humility, until the truth of hard work cut past his defense. He learned to tether his identity to effort rather than privilege. Nicole's road was harder. Addiction is not a line one walks across. It is a canyon to cross, with pieces taken out of each step. There were clinics, counselors, rehab centers, places that accepted her but could not make her repentant. Repentance arrived in small epiphanies. The smell of disinfectant that meant someone had washed a wound she had left open. The kindness of a nurse who gave her time. The shame of waking to a text message she could not explain. She found steadier footing when she began to help in the clinic, washing down surfaces, filing charts, sitting with people who had less than she did. Service did not fix everything for Nicole, but it offered a practice that taught consistency. Kevin, on the other hand, did not become a trophy given solemnly to a family who could manufacture sanctity. He continued to return to the bridge. He insisted on keeping that tie, even when Samuel offered a place in a small school. He taught the other children to read and insisted they teach him what they knew. He kept pushing for the littlest decisions to rest with the people they served. Let them say what they need, not let us decide for them, he told Samuel once. With a presumption of wisdom Samuel knew he had not earned. You're the pastor, Samuel said. Aren't you supposed to follow what I tell you? I'm supposed to follow what is right, Kevin said back, eyes too steady for a child. Sometimes right looks like staying. The media, hungry for drama, transformed these nuances into clickbait. A streaming headline ran, "Billionaire pastor to name homeless child heir, shocking move." People shared the story in outrage and in wonder. Critics called it a PR move. Admirers called it prophetic. The truth lay somewhere in the messy middle. A man made a costly moral choice, and people reacted with the messy complexity of watchers. In public, the church's elders debated the prudence and the theology of Samuel's plan. Some feared the dangers of placing too much authority in one person's hands. Others argued that the point of stewardship was to decentralize power, to pass resources not as trophies but instruments of transformation. Samuel listened and learned and acknowledged that the temptation to be theatrical was real. He sought counsel and aimed not at headline making but at structural change. He designed programs where decision-making would include people from the communities served. He directed funds to long-term partnerships focused on education, vocational training, and healthcare clinics run in collaboration with local experts. Time, as it does, kept moving. 5 years passed in a sequence of ordinary, grit-filled moments. The change was not a cinematic overnight miracle. It was an accumulation of small acts that together reenacted what Samuel had hoped for. 5 years later, the bridge had changed. There were fewer plastic cups scattered like confetti and more small tables where people shared soup. A community board had a roster of names: volunteers, apprentices, caregivers. There were classrooms where adults learned trades. There was a clinic with a dented sign and good enough care. Kevin was taller now, hair cropped neatly. He still read aloud sometimes, but he was not the child anymore. He was a young man who tasted responsibility, and less of the world still scared him than once had. Samuel's foundation had funded the partnerships, and Kevin had been a key voice in how the funds were used. He had insisted that jobs be offered not as charity but with contracts and dignity. He had been instrumental in hiring people who came from the community to run the programs. Chris arrived one morning with palms rough and hands full. He had worked as a foreman on a construction crew. He had grown calluses he had not known how to earn before. He arrived wearing a hard hat and looking embarrassed to be proud. Nicole came, too, her hair shorter, her laugh steadier. She had begun to run a small aftercare group in the clinic, sitting with women who had dropped out of programs and refusing to let them fall through the cracks. The family did not look like the family that had once sat in a cold dining room and argued about heritage. They had the bruises of hard work and the soft edges of humility. Samuel's health had begun to decline in those years. There were nights he woke with a tightness in his chest. Not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but the kind of gradual erosion that decades of stress can bring. He grew quieter. He spent long afternoons in the garden, listening to the Bridges radio, reading Kevin's reports, tracing the growth of programs with a husband's quiet pride. Grace sat with him at sundown, their hands close enough that even when they did not speak the language of sermons, they were translating a lifetime of shared choices. When the end grew near, the family gathered in a garden with a table and a pot of tea. It was not a melodramatic scene. It was small, real, filled with the hum of ordinary voices. Samuel looked at his children and at Kevin, and his eyes argued with the years. He had learned that leadership was not the same as owning. He had learned that mercy could be costly. He had learned that the true inheritance was not buildings or banks, but a formed character that could recognize the face of God in a wet Bible. "Thank you," he told them, voice thin but certain. "Thank you for walking with me, even when I made mistakes." Chris, who had once only known the language of entitlement, sat with his head bowed. "I didn't understand," he said. "I thought you were taking things away, but you were trying to give us back what we had lost." Nicole squeezed his hand. Kevin stood at Samuel's other side, no longer a child to be shown off, but a partner to be leaned on. "You taught me what it means to keep a promise," Kevin said. "You taught us not to let people become statistics. You taught us how to listen." Samuel smiled. "I was taught by a boy in the rain," he said. The sentence was simple and true. Kevin later told crowds the story of the wet Bible and the plastic crate, not as a spectacle, but as the plain account of a boy who loved stories, and who found that a man with a stadium could be as poor as anyone else when he had not learned to serve. Kevin's voice on stage was steady and real. He spoke of stewardship not as a program but as a practice, showing up, listening, and then giving for the sake of those who would never be trophies in the press. People were surprised that the thing that shocked them was not the act of naming a child as heir, but the way a man protected his humility by making it costly. That was the point. The moral surprise was a reversal. A man who had always been the image of power falling to his knees in mud to learn. The ministry continued and shifted. Buildings remained, but so did partnerships that allowed previously marginalized leaders to guide programs. Clinics offered basic care and the dignity of paid positions. Apprenticeships taught trades and offered the humility of labor in exchange for future security. Children learned to count not stacks of currency, but the ways generosity could be turned into organized care. It is worth pausing on the subtleties. Change did not erase consequences. There were bitter columns and hard conversations. There were donors who withdrew support because they did not like the loss of control. There were people who accused Samuel of theater. There were also those who walked toward the work and never left. The church learned that repentance and structural change are often correlated, and that sometimes the path of repentance includes material reorientation that creates friction. The most important arc, however, was internal. Chris worked until his hands were honest. Nicole learned to find rhythm in serving others. Kevin learned to lead with humility, to check decisions with the people affected by them. Moses, the old security guard, watched these changes as one who had been the quiet conscience of the nights. He had never sought credit. He had always been the bridge between sturdy men and softer hearts. And Samuel. He died in the garden with grace at his side, with the family present. Not everything had been healed. Not all strains had dissolved into symmetry, but the end was, in its small way, a testament to the messy reality of change. Costly, gradual, human. At the funeral, people filled the chapel with an odd mixture of respect and confusion. Some still could not parse the man who had been both beloved and controversial. Kevin spoke not as a showman, but as someone who had been loved into an assignment. "He taught me how to be a steward," he said, voice steady enough to carry over the hush. "He also taught me how to make mistakes and fix them. He taught me that money is not the point. People are." The legacy Samuel left was not a tidy ledger of numbers. It was a complicated inheritance clauses and council a site of livelihoods built, programs started, and, most importantly, people entrusted with decision-making power. The funds did what money can sometimes do best when given away. They multiplied through relationship, accountability, and the steady labor of a community. The final image the city carried for years was not of the polished suit but of a mud-stained man who had knelt. The photographs people remembered were not only the stage lights but also a plastic crate under a bridge with a Bible whose corners had been smoothed by thumb and faith. Kevin, years later, would stand at the same podium his mentor had once filled and tell a simpler sermon. What do you have when everything is taken away? You have your heart. You have your willingness to serve. People asked whether Samuel's choices were reckless. They were, in part. They were also the kind of recklessness that promises fruit when it comes tethered to accountability and to communities who know their own needs. The story was not a blueprint. It was a parable of moral imagination about how wealth might be used and what humility looks like when it is practiced publicly and painfully. There was a moment, years after Samuel's death, when Kevin returned to the bridge at dusk. The place had changed but remained itself in essential ways. He opened the same Bible he had once pulled through page and rein. He read to a circle of kids with faces like cracked coins and clean grammar. He read the words, not to hold them in some holy vacuum, but so they could be translated into meals, jobs, clinics, and honest work. "Why did you keep coming back?" someone asked him later in a filmed interview. "Why not stay at the house?" Kevin looked at the river that passed under the bridge, the same water that had once washed mud up to his knees. "Because I promised them I'd be here," he said. "And also, because being here teaches me how to stay human." The shock the world expected had been misunderstood. It wasn't the spectacle of a billionaire naming a child in the wash of rhetoric. The shock was the humility that cost him everything he had, built a rearrangement of priorities that made material resources subordinate to human flourishing. It was scandalous to some and holy to others. But most of all, it was real. At the end of this story, there is no neat moral that fits every life. There is only invitation to look at the people under the bridges we pass and to consider what stewardship truly requires. There is an ethic in Samuel's fallible courage. Do the uncomfortable thing. Consult wisely, and place decision-making power as near as possible to those most affected. There is also a warning. Grand gestures without accountability breed spectacle, not transformation. Kevin would end up telling people one message again and again, not as a declamation but as a quiet insistence. "The Bible kept me warm in the rain," he would say, "but the best thing I inherited was not a bank book. It was a way of being in the world that kept people from being invisible." If this story touched you, if the image of a man kneeling in the mud or the image of a child reading to a circle of the overlooked stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that real compassion costs something. Look for a local outreach, volunteer your time, or simply offer your presence. Actions, not just headlines, remake the world.